That was, I think, very likely as true as Malaby made it sound, but if there ever had been any chance at all, it was gone by the time we reached home. Somehow, and apparently overnight, the public had put several twos together at last. The half-hearted attempt to represent the depth bomb as one of a series of tests had broken down altogether. The vague fatalism with which the loss of the Keweenaw and other ships had been received was succeeded by a burning sense of outrage, a satisfaction that the first step in vengeance had been taken, and a demand for more. The atmosphere was similar to that at a declaration of war. Yesterday's phlegmatics and sceptics were, all of a sudden, fervid preachers of a crusade against against whatever it was that had had the insolent temerity to interfere with the freedom of the seas. Agreement on that cardinal point was virtually unanimous, but from that hub, speculation radiated in every direction, so that not only fireballs, but every other unexplained phenomenon that had occurred for years was in some way attributed to, or at least connected with, the mystery in the deeps. The wave of worldwide excitement struck us when we stopped off for a day at Karachi on our way home. The place was bubbling with tales of sea serpents and visitations from space, and it was clear that whatever restrictions Bocker might have put on the circulation of his theory, a good many million people had now arrived at a similar explanation by other routes. This gave me the idea of telephoning the EBC in London to find out if Bocker himself would now unbend enough for an interview. He did, to the representatives of a few carefully selected organs, but it added little to the script we had already put together on the journey from Karachi to London. His repeated plea for the sympathetic approach was so contrary to the public mood as to be almost unusable. Once more, however, we had a demonstration that bellicose indignation is not self-sustaining. You just can't have a rousing fight for long with a sandbag, and little happened to animate the situation. The only step for weeks was that the Royal Navy, partly in deference to public feeling, but probably more for reasons of prestige, also sent down a bomb. It went off quite spectacularly, I understand, but the only recorded result was that the shores of the South Sandwich Islands were so littered with dead and decaying fish for weeks afterwards that they stank to heaven. Then, by degrees, a feeling began to get about that this was not at all the way anyone had expected an interplanetary war to be, so quite possibly it was not an interplanetary war after all. From there, of course, it was only a step to deciding that it must be the Russians. The Russians had all along discouraged within their dictatorate any tendency for suspicion to deviate from its proper target of capitalistic warmongers. When whispers of the interplanetary notion did in some way penetrate their curtain, they were countered by the statements that A, it was all a lie, a verbal smokescreen to cover the preparations of warmongers, B, that it was true, and the capitalists, true to type, had immediately attacked the unsuspecting strangers with atom bombs, and C, whether it were true or not, the USSR would fight unswervingly for peace with all the weapons it possessed, except germs. The swing continued. People were heard to say, that interplanetary stuff? Don't mind telling you that I very nearly fell for it at the time, but of course when you start to actually think about it, wonder what the Russian game really is. Must have been something pretty big to make 'em use A-bombs on it. Thus, in quite a short time, the status quo antebellum hypotheticum was restored, and we were back on the familiarly comprehensible basis of international suspicion. The only lasting result was that marine insurance stayed up 1%. Things, Phyllis complained, sort of die on us. We looked like being the popular authorities on fireballs. In fact, for a week or two we were. Then the interest faded away, and there were fewer of them, until now, if anyone sees one, he just regards it as a hallucination that he's not going to be taken in by. We didn't do so badly on that first dive, but you can't go on sustaining interest in just a couple of fused cables. We fell down badly somehow on not hearing of the Bocker business until it was practically stale, and I still don't understand how we missed it. At the bomb dropping, we were simply two of the crowd. When all the excitement boiled up, it did look as if we might come into our own, but now that's all fizzled out. Everything's gone quiet again everywhere. It can't be that there's nothing happening. It isn't, I said. If you'd read the papers properly, you'd see that 2 more bombs have gone down in the last week. One in the Cocos Keeling Basin and the other in the Prince Edward Deep. I didn't see that. News value practically nil at the moment. You have to read the small print. It doesn't help when they choose outlandish places to send them down either. There must be plenty of deep places somebody's heard of. Presumably none of the civilized regions will put up with bombs on their own doorsteps, and who's to blame them? I wouldn't fancy a coastline that's all radioactive water full of dead fish by the million myself. But it does show that they've not shelved the whole thing. The Navy, I mean. Apparently not. Mightn't it be worth going to Whitehall and seeing your Admiral again? He's a captain, I told her, but I considered the idea. Last time we met, it wasn't really I that had the success with him, I pointed out. Oh, I see, said Phyllis. Dinner, Tuesday? I'll put it to him from you. I'm sure there must be a name for this kind of thing, she said. The way I have to work, one day you'll find it's misfired and you've cut yourself out. Darling, you know you thoroughly enjoy the art of the little finger, and you'd be furious if I concealed you under a bushel. That's all very well, she said, but I'd just like to feel a little more certain whose little finger we're talking about. Captain Winters came to dinner. Would you, asked Phyllis, leaning back on her pillow with her hands behind her head and studying the ceiling, would you call Mildred attractive? Yes, darling, I replied promptly. Oh, said Phyllis, I thought perhaps so. We pondered. It looked mutual, she observed. It was meant to look, absorbed, I told her. Oh, it did, she assured me. Darling, the position is positively awkward, I pointed out. If I were to tell you that one of your best friends is unattractive, I'm not at all sure that she is one of my best friends. But she's not unattractive. Your own appearance, I remarked, I would describe as rapt. The manner trustful, the eyes a little starry, the smile a little enchanted, the overall effect quite bewitching. You know that, of course, but I thought I'd mention it. It was so well done. Unusually well, I thought. She shifted slightly. The captain's a very attractive man, she said. Ah, well then, we've had a nice evening with two attractive people, haven't we? And they had to be stopped from attracting one another, channeled, as it were. She said. Darling, you're not jealous of my poor little histrionic talent? No, it just seemed to have improved, that's all. Sweetie, I said, I am almost constantly treated to the spectacle of a variety of men wrestling with the pangs of temptation, and I feel great sympathy for them. She let the nearer hand stray from behind her head. I don't want them, she said. Darling, I remarked somewhat later, I begin to wonder if we ought not to see more of Mildred. She said doubtfully, but the captain too. Which reminds me, if you aren't too sleepy, what did the captain have to say? Oh, a lot of nice things. Irish blood there, I think. But passing from the really important to matters of mere worldwide interest, I suggested patiently. He wouldn't let go of much, but what he did say wasn't encouraging. Some of it was rather horrid. Tell me. Well, the main situation doesn't seem to have altered a lot on the surface, but they're getting increasingly worried about what's happening below. The general flap and scare worried the authorities. It unsettled people, and they were uneasy lest what was just an excitement and a thrill might turn into a panic. From the way he spoke, I think there must have been quite a bit of manoeuvring behind the way it has all calmed down. And he didn't actually say that investigation has made no progress either, but what he did say implied it. For instance, echo soundings don't help. You can tell where the bottom is, but that tells you nothing about what may be on the bottom there. The shallower, secondary echoes may be off large creatures, shoals of fish, or anything, but there's no means of being sure what they are off. Some of them seem to be static, but no one's sure about that. Depth microphones don't help much. At some levels there's practically nothing, at others there's just a meaningless pandemonium of fish noises, like we heard from that telebath thing. And they don't let them down really deep on a steel cable because of what happened to that research ship and some of the others. They've tried with a cable which was a non-conductor, but the mic leads burnt out at about 1,000 fathoms. They sent down a television camera adapted for infrared instead of visible rays, on the theory that it might be less provocative, and insulated the gear from all the rest of the ship. That was a good thing, because at about 800 fathoms up came a charge that jumped fuses and melted half their instruments. He says that atomic bombs are out, for the moment at any rate. You can only use them in isolated places, and even then the radioactivity spreads widely. They kill an awful lot of fish quite uselessly and make a lot more radioactive. The fisheries experts on both sides of the Atlantic have been raising hell and saying that it's because of the bombings that some shoals have been failing to turn up in the proper places at the proper times. They've been blaming the bombs for upsetting the ecology, whatever that is, and affecting the migratory habits. But a few of them are saying that the data aren't sufficient to be absolutely sure that it is the bombs that have done it, but something certainly has, and it may have serious effects on food supplies. And so, as nobody seems to be quite clear what the bombs were expected to do, and all they do is to kill and bewilder lots of fish at great expense, they've become unpopular just now. Most of that we already know, I remarked. But when it's on parade, it certainly makes a fine upstanding body of negatives. Well, here's one you didn't know. 2 of those bombs they've sent down haven't gone off. Oh, I said, and what do we infer from that? I don't know, but it has them worried, very worried. You see, the way they're set to operate is by the pressure at a given depth. Simple and pretty accurate. Meaning that they never reached the right pressure zone. Must have got hung up somewhere on the way down. Phyllis nodded. That alone would take a bit of explaining. But what worries them still more is that there is a secondary setting, quite independent, just in case it happens to land on a submarine mountain or something. It works with a time switch, only with these 2, it hasn't. Ah, I said. Perfectly simple, my dear Watson. The water got in and stopped the clock, I told her. It's your name that's very suitably Watson. I'm only labelled that way for the duration, Phyllis said coldly. Anyway, there's nothing perfectly simple about it, and it's made them extremely anxious. Well, understandably, too. I'd not feel too happy myself if I'd mislaid a couple of live atom bombs, I admitted. What else? 3 cable repair ships have unaccountably disappeared. One of them was cut off in the middle of a radio message. She was known to be grappling for a defective cable at the time. When was this? One about 6 months ago, one about 3 weeks ago, and one last week. They might not be anything to do with it. They might not, but everyone's pretty sure they are. No survivors to tell what happened? None. Presently I asked, anything more? Let me see. Oh, yes. They are developing some kind of guided depth missile which will be high explosive, not atomic, but it hasn't been tested yet. I turned to look at her admiringly. That's the stuff, darling, the real Mata Hari touch. Have you got the drawings? You goof. It's only because they don't want people unsettled that it's not been published in the newspapers. That, and the fact that the newspapers agree. The last hullabaloo sent the sales graphs dipping everywhere, and the advertisers didn't like it. There's no need for ordinary security measures. Nobody's going to dangle a telephone into the Mindanao Trench and ask if anybody down there would like to buy some interesting information. I suppose not, I admitted. Even the services use common sense sometimes, she said pointedly, and then added on a second thought, though there are probably several things he didn't tell me. Probably, I agreed again. The most important thing is that he is going to give me an introduction to Dr. Matet, the oceanographer. I sat up. But, darling, the Oceanographical Society has more or less threatened to excommunicate anybody who deals with us after that last script. It's part of their anti-Boca line. Well, Dr. Matet happens to be a friend of the captain's. He's seen his Fireball incidents maps, and he's a half-convert. Anyway, we're not convinced Boccarites, are we? What we think we are isn't necessarily what other people think we are. Still, if he's willing, when can we see him? I hope to see him in a few days' time, darling. Don't you think I should? No. But it's sweet of you not to trust me still. But no. And now it's time we went to sleep, she said firmly. The beginning of Phyllis's interview was, she reported, almost standard. EBC, said Dr. Matet, raising his eyebrows like miniature doormats. I thought Captain Winters said BBC. He was a man with a large frame, sparingly covered, which gave his head the appearance of properly belonging to a still larger frame. His tanned forehead was high and well polished, back to the crown. This dome was hedged about with wiry grey hair which stuck out in tufts over each ear. His bright eyes peered at one past a pronouncedly Roman nose. His large, responsive mouth surmounted a slightly cleft chin. As if all this dominating apparatus were slightly too heavy for him, he stooped. He gave one, Phyllis said, a feeling of being overhung. She sighed inwardly and started on the routine justification of the English Broadcasting Company's existence with assurances that sponsorship did not necessarily connote venality, venenosity, or even vapidity. He found this an interesting point of view. Phyllis recited examples of illustrious EBC occasions and persons and worked him round gradually until he had reached the position of considering us nice enough people striving manfully to overcome the disadvantages of being considered a slightly second-class oracle. Then, after making it quite clear that any material he might supply was strictly anonymous in origin, he opened up a bit. The trouble from Phyllis's point of view was that he did it on a pretty academic level, full of strange words and instances which he had to interpret as best she could. The gist of what he had to tell her, however, seemed to be this. A year ago there had begun to be reports of discolorations in certain ocean currents. The first observation of the kind had been made in the Kuroshio current in the North Pacific, an unusual muddiness flowing northeast, becoming less discernible as it gradually widened out along the west wind drift until it was no longer perceptible by the naked eye. Samples were taken and sent for examination, of course, and what do you think the discoloration turned out to be? Said Dr. Mattet. Phyllis looked properly expectant. He told her. Mainly radiolarian ooze, but with an appreciable percentage of diatomaceous ooze. How very remarkable, Phyllis said safely. Now what on earth could produce a result like that? Ah, said Dr. Mattet, that is the question. A disturbance on a quite remarkable scale, even in samples taken on the other side of the ocean, off the coast of California, there was still quite a heavy impregnation of both these oozes. That's astonishing, isn't it? Said Phyllis. The effects? One cannot hope to foresee more than the most obvious effects. Some changes in fish migrations are already becoming noticeable, and a certain increase in sea vegetation along the course, as one would expect. Naturally, with the water diametriciously richer, he went on for some time, with Phyllis trying not to look too much as if she were grasping straws behind him. At last he said, "This, obviously, is of immense interest and the greatest importance, but naturally the most interesting question to us is why it should happen at all, and is continuing to happen. What, in fact, can have occurred that could be responsible for sending this sediment from the greatest depths to the surface in such amazing quantities?" Phyllis felt that it was time she made a contribution. "Well, there was that atomic bomb off the Marianas. I should think that would have made quite a stir down below," she said. Dr. Mattet regarded her severely. That bomb was dropped after the phenomenon had been observed, and in any case it is highly doubtful whether the results of a disturbance there would have been concentrated into the Kuroshio. "Oh," said Phyllis. "It is, as you know, an actively volcanic area," Dr. Mattet launched off again, "so that one's natural inclination would be to attribute the disturbance to the opening of some new vent or vents on the sea bottom. The seismograph records, however, give no support to that view. No major seismic shock has been registered." Phyllis went on listening patiently while he demolished earthquakes as a possible cause. "And yet," she remarked at the end of it, "something not only was, but still is going on down there." "Something is," he agreed, looking at her. Then, with a sudden descent to the vernacular, he added, "But to be honest with you, Lord knows what it is." He went on. Phyllis learned that since then, similarly unexplained somethings had been throwing up deep-sea sediments into the monsoon drifts off Guatemala, and also across the other side of the isthmus into the Mosquito Current. A thickening of the waters in equatorial mid-Atlantic had been observed, and the most recent report was of ooze appearing in the West Australian Current. There were also several minor irregularities of the same kind. Phyllis did her best to list them for possible reference, but just before she left she managed to put in a question on the aspect which seemed to her most interesting and important. "Tell me this, Dr. Mattet," she asked. "Do you think it is serious? I mean, is it a thing that worries you?" He smiled at her. "Oh, it doesn't keep me awake at night, if that's what you mean. No, our worry about it, if you can call it that, is that we don't like having to admit that we are utterly baffled in our own bailiwick. As for its effect, well, I should think that might be beneficial. There is a great deal of nutritious ooze lying wasted on the sea bottom. The more of it that comes up, the more the plankton will thrive. And the more the plankton thrives, the more the fish will thrive. Consequently, the price of fish ought to go down, which will be very nice for those who like fish, of which I am not one. No, what troubles me is that I feel I ought to be able to answer a simple why on the matter. After all, I am supposed to have been an expert for a number of years now." "Too much geography," said Phyllis, "and too much oceanography, and too much bathyography, too much of all the geographies, and lucky to escape ichthyology." "Tell me," I said. She did, with notes. And she concluded, "I'd like to see even Mrs. Hawkes scribe a script out of that lot." I said, "There's no about it. Some kind of ographer might give a talk on it to highbrows and low listening figures, but even if he were intelligible, where'd it get anybody? That, I remarked, is the key question each time. But little by little, the bits do accumulate. This is another bit. You didn't really expect to come back with the stuff for a whole script anyway." He didn't suggest how this might link up with the rest of it. No. I said it was sort of funny how everything seemed to be happening down in the most inaccessible parts of the ocean lately, and a few things like that, but he didn't rise. Very cautious. I think he was rather wishing he had not agreed to see me, so he stuck to verifiable facts. Eminently non-wheedleable at first meeting, anyhow. He admitted he doesn't know, but he's not going to make any guesses that might send his reputation the way Bocca's has gone. What it amounts to is that he'd like it to be volcanic, but it can't be because of the evidence, and it's not likely that it is due to an explosion or series of explosions of any kind, because it keeps on coming up in a more or less steady flow, which suggests that the force at work is both immense and continuous. Now you have a shot at it. Look, I said, Bocca must have got to know about this as soon as anyone did. He ought to have some views on it, and it might be worth trying to find out what they are. That select press conference of his that we went to was almost an introduction. He went very coy after that, she said, doubtfully. Not surprising, really. Still, we weren't among the ones who panned him publicly. In fact, we were very objective. "Toss you which of us rings him up," I offered. "I'll do it," she said. "I suppose it's being a victim of the charm myself that stops me being jealous of the supreme self-confidence it inspires," I said. "OK. Go ahead." So I leant back comfortably in my chair and listened to her going through the opening ceremony of making it clear that she was the EBC, not the BBC. I will say this for Bocca, that having proposed his mouthful of a theory and then sold it to himself, he had not ratted on the deal when he found it unpopular. At the same time, he had no great desire to be involved in a further round of controversy when he would be pelted with cheap cracks and drowned in the noise from empty vessels. He made that quite clear when we met. He looked at us earnestly, his head a little on one side, a lock of his grey hair hanging slightly forward, his hands clasped together. He nodded thoughtfully and then said, "You want a theory from me because nothing you can think of will explain this phenomenon. Very well. You shall have one. I don't suppose you'll accept it, but I do ask you, if you use it at all, to use it anonymously. When people come round to my view again, I shall be ready, but I prefer not to be thought of as keeping my name before the public by letting out sensational driblets. Is that quite clear?" We nodded. "What we are trying to do," Phyllis explained, "is to fit a lot of bits and pieces into a puzzle. If you can show us where one of them should go, we're very grateful. If you would rather not have the credit for it, well, that is your own affair, and we'll respect it." "Exactly. Well, you already know my theory of the origin of the deep-water intelligences, so we'll not go into that now. We'll deal with their present state, and I deduce that to be this. Having settled into the environment best suited to them, these creatures' next thought would be to develop that environment in accordance with their ideas of what constitutes a convenient, orderly, and eventually civilized condition. They are, you see, in the position of Well, no, they are actually pioneers, colonists. Once they have safely arrived, they set about improving and exploiting their new territory. What we have been seeing are the results of their having started work on the job. By doing what? I asked. He shrugged his shoulders. How can we possibly tell? But judging by the way we have received them, one would imagine that their primary concern would be to provide themselves with some form of defense against us. For this they would presumably require metals. I suggest to you, therefore, that somewhere down in the Mindanao Deep, and also somewhere in the deep in the southeast of the Cocos-Keeling Basin, you would, if you could go there, find mining operations now in progress. I glimpsed the reason for his demand for anonymity. But the working of metals in such conditions, I said. How can we guess what technology they may have developed? We ourselves have plenty of techniques for doing things which would at first thought appear impossible in an atmospheric pressure of 15 pounds per square inch. There are also a number of unlikely things we can do underwater. But with a pressure of tons and in continual darkness But Phyllis cut across me with that decisiveness which warns me to shut up and not argue. Dr. Bocker, she said, you named 2 particular deeps then. Why was that? He turned from me to her. Because that seems to me the only reasonable explanation where those 2 are concerned. It may be, as Mr. Holmes once remarked to your husband's illustrious namesake, a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. But it is mental suicide to funk the data one has. I know of nothing, and can imagine nothing, that could produce the effect that we have here, except some exceedingly powerful machine for continuous ejection. But, I said a little firmly, for I get rather tired of being dogged by the ghost of Mr. Holmes, if it is mining, as you suggest, then why is the discoloration due to ooze and not grit? Well, firstly, there would be a great deal of ooze to be shifted before one could get to the rock. Immense deposits, most likely. And secondly, the density of the ooze is little more than that of the water, whereas the grit, being heavy, would begin to settle long before it got anywhere near the surface, however fine it might be. Before I could pursue that, Phyllis cut me off again. What about the other places, Doctor? Why mention just those 2? I don't say that the others don't also signify mining, but I suspect from their locations that they may have another purpose. Which is, prompted Phyllis, looking at him, all girlish expectation. Communications, I think. You see, for instance, close to, though far below the area where discoloration begins to occur in the equatorial Atlantic, lies the Romanche Trench. It is a gorge through the submerged mountains of the Atlantic Ridge. Now, when one considers the fact that it forms the only deep link between the eastern and western Atlantic basins, it seems more than just a coincidence that signs of activity should show up there. In fact, it strongly suggests to me that something down below is not satisfied with the natural state of that trench. It is quite likely that it is blocked here and there by falls of rock. It may be that in some parts it is narrow and awkward. Almost certainly, if there were a prospect of using it, it would be an advantage to clear it of ooze deposits down to a solid bottom. I don't know, of course, but the fact that something is undoubtedly taking place in that strategic trench leaves me with little doubt that whatever is down there is concerned to improve its methods of getting about in the depths, just as we have improved our ways of getting about on the surface. There was a silence while we took in that one and its implications. Phyllis rallied first. And the other 2 main places, the Caribbean one and the one west of Guatemala, she asked. Dr. Bocker offered us cigarettes and lit one himself. Well now, he remarked, leaning back in his chair, doesn't it strike you as probable that for a creature of the depths, a tunnel connecting the deeps on either side of the isthmus would offer advantages almost identical with those that we ourselves obtain from the existence of the Panama Canal?
Kraken Wakes was written by John Wyndham and read by Stephen Moore. The programme was produced in Belfast by Susan Carson.